Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin, here in Houston, Texas. And for those of you who are not aware, we just got hit by a Category 3 hurricane. I believe it was Category 3 by the time it really started to hit us. Maybe it was Category 4 at one point.
Hello.
Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm southwest from where I'm located here. But on the Houston area, was able to drop about 50 inches of rain in about a 2-day span, more or less. So that's quite a bit of rain. And as usual, roads and bridges and things of that nature are still inaccessible. So thus it's harder for me to get to and from work. In my part of town in particular, I'm near some reservoirs that had to do controlled releases that continue to flood the area for weeks after the storm has passed. So I'm still stuck in a very strange position. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. That's kind of why we're late today, because of the increased traffic due to those events. But I wanted to get on and have a show today because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And I think it would be almost negligent of me to kind of come on here and say I do politics and talk about politics without doing too much current event stuff. So normally I try to do a history lesson. I try to go back and we can learn from things. But there's a few things that are coming up that's current events, and I don't always cover current events, but they're so important that I think I need to go ahead and speak about them. And so one of these events was actually I'll go in a different order. The first event I'm going to start with is Trump basically placing an expiration date on DACA. And everybody's, rightfully so in some respects, everybody's kind of bothered by this. But ultimately, the question is, why are we bothered by this? What makes, ultimately, I keep saying ultimately, but really what it is we need to have a real conversation. We need to have a real conversation about immigration. And I think that's something we're unable to do because I think for the most part, we're unable to really speak honestly and not be gagged and not be censored by what we're saying. Like nobody really gets to really be honest about kind of like what's going on when it comes to immigration. And I think at this point, it's time we go ahead and have that conversation. So for that, I'm having Richard come on because I know me being me, in my interest of being honest, I'm going to say stuff that's going to offend some people. So just be prepared for that. And if you don't want to be offended, if you don't want to have your ideas challenged, do not listen to this show because I'm basically going to tell you how I feel about it and kind of how I approach the issue. And I'm going to try to be as fair as I possibly can. So
as I would unmute, then the rest of the audience would be able to hear me. But I was just going to say quickly that I can't say that I'm going to be the best proponent for DACA or for the opposing position for whatever Nick's going to bring on. We didn't talk about this very thoroughly beforehand. I was kind of planning on just being behind the scenes, but I don't mind helping out, and I have a feeling that Nick's going to need to be challenged at least on some point, so I'm going to try and do that. And I guess I would put myself in the land of convincible in that I don't eliminate from the realm of possibility that Nick may have a reasonable case before.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
First off, the first thing I'm going to attack, because it makes no sense to me, is there's a mythos surrounding immigration. Like we are a country of immigrants, and everybody deserves to come here, and everybody deserves a chance at the American dream and all that. That's bullshit. I'm just going to be honest and just straight up tell you that is bullshit. Not saying that people don't deserve decent standards of living, but what I'm saying is no one who is born somewhere else is entitled to come live where you live and be where you are. You know what I mean? And what I mean by that is, like, as a nation state, the nation's first responsibility is to the people that live there. That is its real responsibility.
So you wouldn't find yourself in the abolish all.
Come here and live here is preposterous. It's just
you wouldn't find yourself in the abolish all borders camp then. That's
No.
too radical.
I think that that is something that we can work towards, where we don't have like an imbalance like that. Like the nation state in itself is some sort of oppressive structure. And I understand where they're coming from when they make that argument. But what I would say is, you know, first and foremost, let's work on making sure the nation state is responsive to who it's responsible for and who it's supposed to cover, who's under its purview, so to speak. And because of that, I think the mythos of immigrants being able to come here and everybody deserving a chance at the American dream is bullshit. You know, first off, there's not enough resources on the planet for everybody in the world to enjoy the American dream, period.
Well, yeah, regardless of where you do it. But that's
I mean, and that's regardless of where you do it. Yeah. Then there's this idea that, like, by, you know, there's a twin critique, right? That's the first part. But there's also like these two other narratives, like, you know, hey, they just want to live a better life, so they come here and we should accept our arms and all that. Well, look, I know how the world works, and nobody gives a crap about whether or not somebody has a decent standard of living or whether somebody gets a fair shake in this world. The world doesn't work that way. People are using that narrative to play on your emotions, to play on to play on the good side of your whatever humanity you have left in you. They're using that to play on that, to get you to agree with policy that may or may not be rational. And I'm telling you right now, it's just not rational to just admit people, regardless of what the situation is where you are. Now, that may sound horrible, but the real solution is to figure out how can we help people in neighboring countries and other countries such that they don't need to flee? How can we constrain the power of our own country's imperialism and other countries' imperialism, you know, to basically keep people from needing to flee where they are to come to these countries? You know, that's, I mean, really, like when you look at a story of immigration, what you're looking at is, inequality on a global level. And the question is, how can we try to alleviate that inequality in some sort of just and fair manner such that they can live decent lives where they are? And that's the real crux of it. That's really how you tackle immigration, like this letting in, you know, a million people a year and then impoverishing hundreds of millions of people, you know, around the world. And somehow, you know, you feel like you feel better about it because you let in 1 million people. That doesn't do anything. That doesn't get you anywhere. It makes you feel better. And it makes you feel like you've really done something. But that's all it is feelings. Materially, you've done nothing. But let me bring this back. We were talking about immigration generally right there, right? And I said a lot of stuff, but let me talk about DACA specifically.
Well, before that, could I just, I wanted to mention a little bit about like the history of immigration. You talk about the mythos or like the lore surrounding immigration, but to me, my understanding of immigration follows more of a line of path of, well, we're trying to conquer this country, so we need as many people here as we can get in order to have some sort of legitimate claim to as much of the land as we can. And so we encouraged a lot of people to come here and weren't very picky about who came to the country in order to, you know, be genocidally take over the country against the people that inhabited it before the immigrants got here. And immigration has come to mean a lot of different things. And most of the time when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about immigration from the South, particularly Mexico, but a lot of the Central and Southern American countries.
But that wasn't always the case, though.
Immigration itself has taken a long different path, and so like the rhetoric surrounding it has changed depending on the purpose for which the immigration is being used. And like how immigration is being used now is largely exploitative by the corporate class in order to exploit the labor that comes across, and the labor that does come across is largely people fleeing desperate situations and or affluent people looking to become more affluent in the American market. Those are the two primary types of immigration that come in now.
And let's be clear.
And there's also been a net leaving of people, particularly Mexico, over the last like 7 or 8 years. So I think those are some relevant facts that we should talk about generally about immigration. But now you can go back to specifically DACA, or if you wanted to respond.
Well, wait. Let me chime in on what you were saying there. Like, you know, everything that you said there is 100% true. And let's put some context on that information. Like when we're talking about immigration, like you just said, it wasn't always from, Latin American countries, South American countries, Mexico. Like that's a recent thing. That was something that started to pick up around the 70s. You had a lot of European immigration and Chinese immigration. Chinese immigration, particularly in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and you had a lot of immigration from Europe. Also around that same time, particularly like the Irish and Eastern Europeans, coming to America during that time period. But the thing that I will say about when those waves of immigration came, America had something called a labor deficit, meaning we had more work and more capacity to produce but we were constrained by our labor supply. We needed additional labor. So at that point in time, having an immigration policy being what it was, even though it was largely discriminatory and these people were, stuck in like a caste system, some of them, and others were able to come here and after 2 or 3 generations just be white. Even though that being the case and not everybody's treated equal, we understand all that. But for the most part, these people were able to come here and they were able to contribute to America because America had a labor deficit. So now we fast forward to where we are, after the post-war period, and we're looking at America as a very different nation. The time in which these immigrants are coming is a very, very, very different time. Our economic circumstance is a very, very different circumstance. And now we have an issue where we have a labor surplus. So now we're talking about immigration. We went from talking about immigration during a time of labor deficit to a time of labor surplus. And I don't care what anybody says, in America, there are more people available to be trained and skilled into a trade or anything like that. There's more people that can be put to work than there are jobs to be had. So now we have a surplus. So the difference is, when you have a surplus, you have basically employers basically being more powerful. Now they have a lot more room to exploit, but to keep from doing that, we have things called labor protections. We have infrastructure into place, and back in the day we used to have labor unions, but of course that was obliterated, right? But we had these institutions and customs and societal and social norms, right? Social norms basically that would kind of prevent certain things from happening to us as the employer class seek to exploit the labor, basically. But as we see over time, these things kind of get eroded, but there's a mechanism that they can still use. See, there's a certain subsection of people, namely Black people, who are treated as sub citizens or second-class citizens, right? But then, even when they start to unionize or when they try to take things to court and they get things like affirmative action, they start filing equal protection lawsuits and things of that nature, even they can only be exploited to a certain level, right? But they are citizens. What happens if you don't have citizenship? That's a very, very different story. You're very, very ripe. You're very, very ripe to be taken advantage of by all sorts of industries. There's entire industries built upon exploiting people who aren't citizens of the United States because they don't have the same protections. And if they do have the same protections, they lack the political power and the institutions by which they can leverage, to actually be protected by our system. And so now we start to talk about the immigration debate. And I'm going to show literally that when we're talking about people who aren't citizens versus people who are citizens, we don't want to have a situation where we end up creating a situation where we have a pool of people that aren't citizens, but they're not necessarily being deported. They're just there, and they're just a vulnerable pool of people that can be exploited by employers. And I believe that essentially is what DACA does. You're not necessarily a citizen, right? But you're also not going to be deported. But if you cause a trouble, if you do something outside the norm, if you poke your head out, you can be deported. And that's an interesting situation to find yourself in. So the question is, when labor tries to struggle, when people try to get together and unionize and things of that nature, what are you going to do? If you're covered under that sort of action, it's not even legislation or anything. It's just like an action, executive action. If you're under that, like, it's a hard choice to make. Do you try to fight for better conditions for workers, Do you try to unionize and come together with people who are already here to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake, or do you just keep your head down and be socialized into a form where whatever you're given by the employer is still better than where you came from? That's a real good question. And when you have a situation where a population of people are being treated in that manner, you know, there's going to be a backlash, right? There's going to be a nationalist backlash. Like, these people are here and they're lowering the wages and things of that nature. And you know what? To be honest with you, one thing that we have to understand is them being a vulnerable population, them being surplus labor, it does lower wages. It just does. And when conservatives make that argument, you know, it's just fucking true. And I'm sorry to say it, but it is the one point of truth they have. It may be coming from a wrong place. It may be, you know, laced with all sorts of poisons of racism and xenophobia. It may be, but that one point is valid. It is also valid to say that, you know, without these immigrants, many economies, you know, many industries would suffer. That is true too. But the question is, who benefits from an industry that exploits these workers to deliver cheap products? Most of the actual benefit from those things is accruing to the top. It's not necessarily going to everybody else around. You know, you get cheap labor, but doesn't mean anything unless you're an employer.
Well, historically speaking, when labor was exploited, at least in like recent history, like through when labor unions were strong and so on and so forth, that when other forms of labor were exploited, it did go around more. Like it was more evenly distributed. But over recent years, we've seen that the excesses of wealth that have been created by labor inefficiency have been highly concentrated to the top, almost exclusively at the top. And so while traditionally the type of exploitation from globalism that we would see would at least benefit everybody a little bit within cheaper prices, we're actually seeing very little of those lower prices as a result of the exploited labor. We get some of it, but most of that wealth is concentrated again at the top. But continue.
Yeah. And look, I'm not disputing that some people may benefit, but on the whole, when you consider the fact that there's a cost exacted on the community, so because you have it all depends on the way you look at it. If you look at it from the supply side, if you look at it from the demand side, if you look at it from the contradictions of a unstable system side, you know, the different people have different things. But what I will say is, ultimately, if the wages decline as a whole, cost of standards of living generally will decline, right? And that's not good for anyone. And I think that's something we have to recognize. Now, for the top 15 to 20% of America, that doesn't mean much, but for the 80% of America, that means quite a bit. So this idea that, hey, you can say, well, wages on the whole haven't really moved, was like, well, wait a minute, you're talking about averages. Let's talk about targeted communities. Let's talk about, let's talk about specific industries. Let's talk about the agricultural industry. That industry, a lot of Americans who did those jobs were replaced by immigrant workers. Let's talk about, the service industry, cash service industry.
But we also found that, like, when those jobs opened up and there were opportunities for people to do those jobs, the fruit rotted on the vine and just died in the fields and wasn't actually harvested because for one reason or another, I mean, you can characterize it a lot of different ways. I tend to characterize it as people unwilling to accept a certain level of exploitation. There weren't Americans to fill in for those jobs. And it's not because they weren't trained.
And what I would say is, you just have to follow and what I would say is the law of supply and demand would say that you're right. Maybe American workers probably weren't accepting the wages that you were paying, but traditionally, when those jobs paid more, workers held those jobs. Now, perhaps we're running into an overlap in history here, where we're talking about a position when America had a labor deficit versus having a labor surplus. I think that the labor deficit argument probably holds more weight there in your specific instance, where you're saying, there was fruit left on the vine because they weren't Americans to work the job. It's not that there weren't Americans to work the job per se. Maybe there were Americans that would have worked the job if you had paid more. Maybe we didn't have enough labor at that time to do it, but in a later point in time, as you needed less people to actually harvest fruit because of automation and things of that nature, maybe we had enough, and we don't need to import workers to do those jobs at this point in time. You know, those are all reasonable arguments to make.
Well, what happens is in the economy is essentially there becomes a class of work that if you can avoid, you would, and in such a case, if you can have immigrant labor do it, like there's a similar situation in Kuwait, and you can find it elsewhere in the world where immigrants come in to fulfill. And if you have an economy in which you have a certain class of people that are above that and a certain group of people that are not, then for the by and large, like for instance in Kuwait, it's the Kuwaitis are all mostly all right, and most of them are not suffering from a lack of resources. But if you don't have access to the shared resources as being native and whatever other requirements they have, then you're being exploited in the service industries and so on and so forth. And it doesn't matter how wealthy the Kuwaitis get, the service industry continues to get exploited. And so, I mean, I see what you're saying as far as like, and there are narratives that match that when we have more labor than we need, the rhetoric gets more nationalist and immigrants become less popular and so on and so forth. But then when we're sitting on top of large sums of money and people are like, oh, well, why would I want to go work in the field when I can do this other desk job, or I have so much money from my investments, or I have this fat pension that I'm sitting on, or X, Y, or Z. And when we're we have lots of cash, then we're more interested in having other people do some of the jobs that we're less interested in pursuing.
Yeah, and we have to put this into context. You know, we're in a situation where unemployment, the real unemployment and labor participation in this country is very, very extremely low.
Well, you know, I guess I just want to quickly point out, to talk onto your point about the pay, is like the reason why we want to pay people, like we make jobs undesirable, and we don't think that certain jobs are worthy of basically a standard of living, a decent standard of living. And so if we have the opportunity to exploit it, we take it. And only because we can't exploit some people do we end up paying livable wages. And I think this gets at a deeper question of, would corporations use literal and open slave labor if it wasn't illegal? And I think a lot of them would, and I think some of them would argue if they didn't, they would not be doing their duty as shareholders. But I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, so continue.
No. I mean, you know, everything that you just highlighted there was exactly the point I was trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is the argument that these jobs were not being done, and so we needed immigrants to do them. I'm saying that, number one, it's a specious argument. Depending on particularly where you're talking about and what the exact situation is, there could be a multitude of reasonings why a certain job wasn't done. Did you pay enough? You know, were you willing to train? What's the situation of people in the area? You know, there's inequities all over the place. But just to say that these jobs weren't being done by Americans is a simple argument, and it's not accurate. If you pay enough, no matter how bad, no matter backbreaking labor, if you pay enough, somebody will do it. Somebody will put their bodies on the line for a decent standard of living. Somebody will put their body on the line for it, and there'll always be somebody who will do that. The question is, will they do it for whatever you're paying? And in that particular instance, I guess the answer is no.
Well, the problem for them is that then it's not economically feasible to pay what it would cost to get somebody else to do it. And so
again, who determines what's economically feasible? They do, with shadowy accounting that we have no notion of what's going on.
I mean,
we don't know anything about their accounting.
If you believe in the rational, self-interested consumer or not, if you adhere to that, then it wouldn't make any sense for them to lose money letting fruit rot if they could pay somebody to pick it and sell it.
Well, what I'm saying is,
how much
can you pay to pick? How much can you pay in order to have that picked and still be profitable? And ultimately, they're always about maximizing profit. So they pick that number that maximizes profit. Maybe a number, and to be honest with you, labor costs, they always say it's so much, but it's really not really that much when you consider what you get out of a worker. Like, it's really not that much.
I mean, you know, particularly if you balance it against the value created by the labor, like.
Yeah, and that's what I'm doing. Like, as far as like they're saying labor costs, but they might be saying the equipment that they have to buy. But like your actual labor costs, like it just pales in comparison compared to what the actual laborer produces. So because I understand that, like, it's bullshit. Like, you can pay a decent wage and still earn a decent profit. Like, the problem is, you know, everybody gets fixated on a particular margin, like 25%. You know, after everything's said and done, I want to walk away. For every dollar I invested, I want to make, you know, my dollar back plus 25% additional profit. And where'd that profit come from? Well, it came from the worker. That's where it came from. You know, you were out of everything that happened, it came from the worker and the consumer. You were able to squeeze out more money from each worker and squeeze out more money from every consumer and let it accrue all the way up to you. But ultimately, I digress. My point is supply and demand. You can't get people to work at a certain price. You raise the price and somebody will work for it. Period. Now you can say, well, what about cheap goods? I would say that the cheap goods facilitated other sectors of the labor force to be underpaid to maintain their standard of living. It facilitated a lowering of the standard of living for everyone that's not in the top 20%. And even in the top 20%, you know, you might have taken a 1 or 2% haircut here and there, particularly when you're talking about like housing or things that are paid for through debt, things that are debt financed. You took a huge hit on those things, you know. So I just kind of want to get that out there. And to be fair, what I would say is a lot of our universities, they are, you know, immigration is particularly beneficial to them. And, you know, let's say immigration policy would have changed to be more restrictive and to not allow as many immigrants. We would have to reevaluate how our university models would have to basically be changed. We would have to reevaluate how they run, because they kind of depend a lot on immigration as well to kind of subsidize the cheaper tuition charge to students that go to the school, maybe in-state tuition, or like you're a resident of the United States and somebody's paying international fees. They're in a way subsidizing in some small form, and you know, in some schools, a large form. You know, entire programs would be eliminated if we didn't have immigrants. You know, so that's something that's, you know, we have to acknowledge that that's something there too, right?
Oh, and there's also the H-1B1 visas, and also like there's other aspects to immigration that aren't often talked about, and that actually affect more politically what's the influential groups, sectors, particularly the tech sector is heavily influenced by immigration, and it's a similar but slightly different situation there than you see in the traditional service industry jobs that people are more familiar with.
And I think H-1B visas are also bullshit, because really what that is there's only a few sectors that pay well for American workers, and basically once you start to, you know, basically put that in global competition, you know, you're going to also see wages fall there. Like, there's been this huge, like, there's a lot of chutzpah, and I mean, excuse me, there's just a lot of clamoring about, you know, we don't have enough engineers, we don't have enough students majoring in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and we need to push all these kids into programming and all this stuff. And I was like, well, you look, for every engineering graduate that graduates, I mean, for every 5 engineering graduates that graduate, there's 1 entry-level job. So if that is the case, how can you say that we don't have enough kids majoring in these fields? We do have enough kids majoring in these fields. Companies just aren't hiring them. And it's been that way for well over a decade. You know, there's an IEEE paper. It's the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers. That is their association. And basically they put out a paper saying, you know, we have more than enough engineering graduates. There is no shortage of engineers. There is no shortage of technology graduates. You know, so, you know, all of that's just overblown, and it's played out because
but see, they're not out starving on the streets, so there's not enough of them. Once you have engineers starving on the streets, then they're going to be sufficiently motivated to work for an acceptable wage. I think that's the situation that we're facing.
Okay, and look, just trying to get honest and try to get into some of this stuff. We've already burned up just about all our dang time. So let me try to make the other point I want to make about DACA. And I'm not even going to be able to get to my other 2 points. We're going to have to save those for later shows. I'm probably going to have to do some special editions or something maybe next week. Be on the lookout for that. But so basically, I came back to talking about second-class citizenship. That's what DACA is. DACA is second-class citizenship. You're not a citizen. And at any moment, if you mess up, you can be deported. If you make any trouble, you can be deported. And so you're basically making an entire population of vulnerable people that don't have institutionalized protections and saying, well, this is a good thing because they're able to stay here. It's like, well, no. If you want them to stay here, they need to be full citizens with a real path to citizenship. If you have a problem with citizenship, there needs to be some kind of permanent residency and their children are allowed citizenship, yeah, after a generation or something like that. Whatever you want it to be, some kind of, it can all be negotiated. I have no problem with that, but they need to be citizens, and they also need to be basically protected against, you know, predation, basically, from the employer class. And that's what needs to be done. And I'm not against immigration. I'm just against the mythos of immigration. Like this idea that you can just let everybody come here. That's bullshit. So don't even try to make those type of arguments. You want to talk about immigration and be fair, you have to say, look, we have a labor surplus, we have a labor shortage. If we have a labor surplus, we need to start restricting the number of people that can come here. If you want to help alleviate poverty in situations, we have to start constraining our government, reining in imperialism such that the conditions in the countries in which they live are not so bad that they feel they have to flee to America. Period. That's the real solution. That is the real solution. Everybody's seen the gumball video, that gumball video where the guy takes out a gumball and he's got all these gumballs on the table and he talks about immigration and what it does and what it means. It's a very important video. A lot of conservatives use it to prove their point, but that doesn't make what he's saying any less valid. It just makes the way they twist it invalid. But what he's saying is true, you know? So DACA in many ways, in my mind, kind of mirrors the Affordable Care Act. You know, like it's designed to keep you, it's just an executive action. It's designed to keep you tied up. Hey, we got to keep fighting to keep DACA. We're fighting to keep DACA. Well, what about citizenship for all the people that are here? What about citizenship for those people so they don't get, you know, basically predated on by the employer class? What about that? Well, we just need DACA to be in place first. It's never going to be in place and safe so you can move on to the next thing. That's not how politics works. They're never going to let you have a position and be stable on that position. They're always going to attack where you are. They're always going to be forcing you to be on the defense. And the best way to beat that is to be on the offense and fight for what you really need than trying to defend a half-assed policy that really puts you in a precarious position as it is.
I just agree that, and I think a lot of people approach the situation with the feeling that DACA is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I think where some people diverge is where something like Trump doing this is ripping the Band-Aid off, and they're worried that we're going to end up bleeding out rather than coming and finding a better solution.
So here's what it is. I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that analogy. DACA is a Band-Aid on the bullet wound, but guess what? The Band-Aid has poison on it that makes sure the wound will never heal. So as long as that Band-Aid is on there, the wound will never heal. And you may stop some of the bleeding, but you're still bleeding. You're not going to stop all the bleeding. Maybe your body will replenish the amount of blood that you're bleeding out. So you might be in a stable position. You're not going to die, but that wound will never heal as long as you have that Band-Aid on there. What you need is for the wound to heal. You don't need a Band-Aid with poison on it. You need a real Band-Aid that's going to be there to heal the wound. And so what you end up having is you have a situation where you're tied to a policy that's not what you need, and you're stuck defending a policy that's not what you need because it does some good. But in the effort to do that, all your energy is focused on that. You're doing nothing for fighting for the real solution. And that's the problem. You're shooting yourself in the foot. Basically, you're stuck saying, I have to do this for today and focus on today, but you're forgetting that in order to do that, you have to give up tomorrow. And some people will say, no, you can do both at the same time. I argue that you can't.
And some people will say, well, I'm worried about my kid. I'm worried about my cousin, my nephew, my brother, my sister. And well,
I mean, you're worried about them staying here, but you're not ever worried about them being a citizen where they can be fully protected and not predated upon.
Hey, I'm sure they'd be happy to get that, but if it's between worrying about them getting deported right now or worrying about them in future maybe becoming a citizen or making sure they don't get deported right now.
What I'm going to tell you, and what I would tell anybody that makes that argument is it's not a decision between whether they're going to be deported right now or they're not going to have anything at all, blah, blah, blah. That's never the decision. That's just what's put in front of you. There is another option. It's a harder option, but it is there. And you have to accept that sometimes you have to make some sacrifices in order to get the real option in place. Are you going to keep bleeding forever? Eventually, you're not going to be able to to replenish the blood in your body faster than you're bleeding out. You need the wound to heal. You need the wound to be healed. That's what you need to be fighting for. Not DACA. You need to be fighting for a path to citizenship, a real path to citizenship. And guess what? I think you'll find that if you're talking about getting citizenship, and then if you want to gain allies, show that, hey, if you be an ally to us on this particular issue of citizenship, we will engage in the labor struggle to make sure labor is not able to be exploited from the addition of new workers. We will also support that fight. Maybe that kind of argument, you can make that kind of argument. You could kind of bridge the gap between people that are in the labor movement that may not be, you know, necessarily pro-immigration, or people that are in other communities that have been directly hurt by immigration. Because it's not a, you know, rights are not axiomatic, and the interests and things of that, they're not all going to collide. Maybe that's how you can build a coalition. But as far as I can see right now, arguing for DACA and using some kind of mythos that doesn't make any freaking sense is not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, I imagine some people are still going to be skeptical, especially with the immediate family members in danger. But I also recognize that the only reason we're able to do this and have the opportunities that we have is because people, you know, sacrificed and put at risk their life, limb, and reputation and everything in between, so that we could have the chance to be able to speak our minds and be able to say some of the things that we're saying. And so it's probably going to take a lot of sacrifices, but and they're not going to be easy, and people are going to be skeptical, but time will tell.
Yep, and look at that. See, we're already out of time, and I had two more things I wanted to talk about in particular. So let me go ahead and just end with a quote. Sometimes faith is being able to take your first step without being able to see the full staircase. I want to encourage everybody to understand that sometimes you have to make some hard decisions, but these hard decisions are what define you. They're what really lay the groundwork for things later on in life. And so I would argue that we need to stop always focusing on the here and now, because we're never going to be stable in the here and now. We need to start focusing on long-term planning. Like, if I sacrifice now, if I bleed today, if I put something at risk today, I can finally win a better tomorrow. Good night.